Welcome to this exploration of one of the most unsettling chapters in American history. Today, we venture into the shadows of the Smoky Mountains, where two young brothers vanished without a trace during the cold autumn of 1861. Share where you are watching from, and prepare for a story that has echoed through generations, yet remains without resolution. The Great Smoky Mountains stand as silent sentinels between North Carolina and Tennessee, perpetually wrapped in the mist that bestowed their name. In that era, before the Civil War reshaped the nation, these mountains were the domain of resilient pioneers, small, isolated settlements, and bold travelers who risked treacherous paths in pursuit of new beginnings. The year 1861 was a time of mounting national tension, when families were forced to choose sides, and suspicion lingered over every encounter on dusty roads. It was in late October that brothers Thomas and William Brennan departed their family farm in Sevier County, Tennessee, on a journey intended to last merely 3 days. Thomas, age 23, possessed brown hair and light eyes, a legacy from his Irish mother. William, 2 years his junior, had a sturdy build and a ready smile that easily won over strangers. Both worked to the family's modest farm, cultivating corn and raising pigs on the rocky slopes typical of the mountainous terrain. The trip's purpose was straightforward and essential: to procure farming tools and provisions for the coming winter from Gatlinburg, a small town nestled near the Little Pigeon River. The distance was no more than 30 miles, yet the winding mountain trails rendered any journey an unpredictable endeavor. On that Monday morning, October 28th, the brothers loaded their wagon, hitched to 2 mixed-breed horses, bid farewell to their widowed mother and younger brother, and promised to return by nightfall on Wednesday. Mrs. Martha Brennan watched her sons disappear down the trail, swallowed by the morning fog, never imagining this would be her last sight of them. Nothing seemed unusual that morning, with no dark portents beyond a mother's natural worry for her children heading alone into the perilous mountains. The sky hung heavy with low clouds, typical for the season when autumn paints the forests in a mosaic of orange and gold before winter's harsh snows arrive. The initial days passed without news, causing no immediate alarm, as communication then relied entirely on messengers and chance road encounters. Families often endured weeks without word from traveling relatives. However, by Saturday, November 1st, with the brothers still absent, unease settled over the Brennan household. The youngest brother, 16-year-old Samuel, took the family's remaining horse and retraced the trail to Gatlinburg, hoping to find Thomas and William delayed by a wagon mishap or enjoying local hospitality. What Samuel learned in Gatlinburg plunged the family into an abyss of terror and doubt. Local merchants confirmed the brothers had arrived around noon on Tuesday, October 29th. They purchased tools, sacks of flour, salt, gunpowder, and other goods, paying in silver coin. Witnesses reported the pair were in good spirits, briefly discussed rising political tensions, and departed town around 3 p.m., taking the main trail back to Sevier County. They were never seen again. Samuel returned home heartbroken with the devastating news. His brothers had vanished somewhere between Gatlinburg and their farm, a section of trail crossing some of the Smoky Mountains' most densely forested and isolated areas. The family hastily organized a search party of neighbors and locals, men familiar with the mountains and their dangers. For 5 straight days, they scoured every trail bend, investigated ravines, explored known caves, and questioned inhabitants of the few scattered cabins in that wilderness. The search yielded absolutely nothing. No sign of the wagon, the horses, the newly bought tools, or the brothers themselves. It was as if Thomas and William Brennan had simply dissolved into the characteristic mountain mist. The utter lack of traces made the case profoundly disturbing. Even a fatal accident should have left wreckage, wheel tracks, or some evidence. Yet the mountains remained silent and impenetrable. Sevier County Sheriff Jacob Morrison, a 50-year-old man known for his efficiency, officially assumed the investigation in November's second week. This case, however, perplexed him from the outset. He coordinated a more extensive search with experienced trackers who knew every back trail and hidden path in the Smokies. He interrogated travelers who had passed through the area during those days, visited taverns and waypoints along trade routes, and offered a reward for information, all without result. Local newspapers began publishing articles on the mysterious disappearance. The Knoxville Register, Eastern Tennessee's leading paper, devoted half a page to the case on November 15, 1861, describing the Brennan brothers and urging anyone with information to contact Sevier County authorities. The article speculated on possible explanations, from natural accidents to wild animal encounters, but avoided the darker possibility beginning to haunt the community, that something far more sinister had occurred on that foggy trail. The Smoky Mountains of that period were a land of extreme contrasts, where working-class families and religious communities coexisted with the frontier's darker elements, deserters, fugitives, and men who had abandoned their pasts. Occasional reports of highway robberies surfaced, though they rarely ended in lethal violence. Yet the complete absence of any trace in the Brennan case did not fit typical banditry patterns. Thieves would likely have abandoned the looted wagon, let the horses stray, or sold them elsewhere. None of this happened. As November progressed, and the first snows dusted the highest peaks, hope of finding Thomas and William alive dissipated like morning mist. The Brennan family entered a peculiar state of mourning, an incomplete grief born from having no bodies to bury, no certainty to conclude their loss. Martha Brennan aged visibly, her hair turning whiter each day, her eyes forever fixed on the trail, as if her will alone could summon her sons from the shadows. Sheriff Morrison expanded his investigation beyond Sevier County, sending detailed letters to authorities in neighboring counties of North Carolina and Tennessee, meticulously describing the brothers, the wagon, and the horses. Each letter included the exact date of their disappearance, October 29th in the afternoon, and requested that livestock dealers, blacksmiths, and tavern owners be alert for any attempts to sell matching property. Responses began arriving in December, all negative, with no promising leads. An intriguing detail emerged from Morrison's interviews. A farmer named Elijah Cooper, whose land lay roughly midway between Gatlinburg and the Brennan farm, reported hearing strange sounds on the afternoon of October 29th, around 5 p.m., as light faded. Cooper described the sounds as muffled screams, possibly human, emanating from the direction of the main trail. He considered investigating, but deemed the distance too great and dusk too dangerous, dismissing the noises as travelers frightened by a bear or other wildlife a common occurrence. This testimony introduced a grim new dimension. If those screams belonged to the Brennan brothers, something terrible had happened on that specific trail segment. Morrison organized a concentrated search of the area, but weeks of November, rains had obliterated any useful evidence. The muddy ground showed no signs of struggle. The dense vegetation appeared undisturbed, and the trail lay silent as an unmarked grave. The local community began crafting its own theories. In Gatlinburg, taverns, and after church gatherings, speculation flourished. Some suggested the brothers had fled westward, abandoning their hardscrabble Tennessee life for opportunities beyond the Mississippi, a theory that made little sense to those who knew them as responsible young men, deeply attached to their family. Others whispered of cavemen, individuals said to inhabit the Smokies' unexplored depths, occasionally emerging to attack travelers, a blend of folklore and genuine fear of the unknown. The mountains harbored countless caves, some mapped, others not, potentially serving as hideouts for fugitives or deserters living on society's fringe. Yet again, the total absence of traces made this explanation difficult to accept. Even bandits left clues. A more disturbing theory circulated quietly in private conversations. Perhaps the brothers had witnessed something they shouldn't have, like an illegal operation or a secret meeting related to the escalating political tensions preceding the Civil War. Tennessee was a divided territory, with conflicting Unionist and Confederate loyalties. That autumn of 1861, clandestine gatherings occurred in secluded spots. Could Thomas and William have accidentally stumbled upon such a meeting and been eliminated to ensure silence? Morrison discreetly investigated this possibility, aware that direct questions about secret political activities could endanger his own life. He spoke informally with influential figures on both sides of the political divide, attempting to detect any nervousness or hidden knowledge. But his efforts revealed nothing concrete, only confirming that the Smoky Mountains were then a territory of many secrets, where everyone held information they preferred to keep hidden. Winter arrived in full force in December, burying the mountains in deep snow that halted all searches until spring. The investigation entered forced hibernation, though Morrison continued pursuing every flimsy lead. A horse dealer in Asheville, North Carolina, reported seeing animals matching the Brennan horse's description, but Morrison's January 1862 journey there revealed the horses had belonged to a local rancher for over 3 years. Martha Brennan found no peace, experiencing disturbing dreams of her children calling from the misty depths, their voices distorted by icy wind. Neighbors reported seeing her walking alone along the trail on snowy days, a solitary black-clad figure searching for signs that never appeared. Samuel, now her only remaining son, shouldered the farm's responsibilities entirely, yet the shadow of loss loomed over everything. Newspapers lost interest as the war consumed public attention. Bloody battles in other states dominated headlines, reducing the disappearance of 2 young men in the Tennessee mountains to a minor tragedy within the national cataclysm. The Knoxville Register last mentioned the case in March 1862, with a brief note stating the investigation remained inconclusive. However, that spring, as snow melted and trails became passable again, an unexpected discovery reignited the case and raised alarming new questions. A hunter named Benjamin Walsh, traversing a remote area about 12 miles south of the main trail, found the wreckage of a wagon partially concealed under dense vegetation and fallen branches. The wood was rotted from exposure, but specific characteristics matched the description of the Brennan brothers' wagon. Walsh had stumbled upon the wreckage while pursuing a wounded deer into a deep ravine far from any known path. The wagon lay on its side, deliberately hidden under branches, and leaves accumulated over the winter. Walsh immediately recognized this was no natural accident. Someone had intentionally concealed the wreckage. Sheriff Morrison reached the scene 2 days later, accompanied by Samuel Brennan and 3 experienced trackers. The 4-hour hike to the ravine involved descending steep slopes and crossing icy spring streams. The location was exceptionally remote, even for the Smokies, a place few would venture without specific purpose, indicating the hider possessed intimate terrain knowledge and careful planning. Upon clearing the branches and examining the wagon, they found it empty. No tools, no sacks of flour, none of the supplies purchased in Gatlinburg. The wheels were intact, contradicting the mechanical accident theory. The wood bore axe marks in places, as if someone had begun dismantling it, but stopped midway. Samuel positively identified the wagon through 3 parallel notches his father had carved into the rear axle years earlier. Morrison and his men meticulously searched the surrounding ravine area in widening circles. They uncovered more items shallowly buried under leaves and soil, a piece of horse harness, fabric fragments possibly from clothing, and most chillingly, a small leather-bound Bible inscribed with the name Martha Brennan on its first page. This Bible was a gift from his mother to Thomas years earlier, an object he always kept with him. The book was stained and damaged by moisture, but remained identifiable. The absence of the horses deeply puzzled Morrison. Live animals were valuable and traceable. Anyone who had taken the Brennan horses would have eventually needed to sell them, which should have left a trail unless the animals had been killed, an inexplicable waste, or taken far beyond the reach of Morrison's communications. He dispatched further letters to authorities in Kentucky, Virginia, and even territories beyond the Mississippi, providing detailed descriptions of the horses from Samuel. Despite 3 full days of intensive searching, no bodies were found in or near the ravine. This presented a dark enigma. If Thomas and William had been murdered there, where were their remains? The Smoky Mountains were home to bears, wolves, and other predators that could consume evidence over months, but they typically left behind bones, torn clothing, or some human traces. The forest's complete silence regarding the brothers' fate grew increasingly ominous. Morrison began to consider previously unlikely scenarios. What if the brothers were still alive somewhere, held against their will? Kidnappings were rare, but not impossible, especially in wartime when desperate people took extreme measures. Perhaps Thomas and William had been forced to work in some clandestine mountain operation, illegal mining, or unauthorized whiskey production. This theory offered a glimmer of hope to Martha Brennan, though Morrison knew that after so many months, the chances of finding them alive were slim. The discovery of the wagon sparked renewed public interest. The Knoxville Register published a lengthy article in May 1862, recounting the entire disappearance and detailing the findings in the ravine. Other newspapers in larger cities like Nashville and even Richmond, Virginia, picked up the story. For a few weeks, the Brennan brothers' mystery became the talk of taverns and saloons throughout the southern Appalachian Mountains. This public attention had unexpected consequences. People began arriving in Gatlinburg and Sevier County, claiming to have information about the case. Most were opportunists seeking the reward Morrison had offered, fabricating elaborate stories with no basis in fact. But among the charlatans, one testimony emerged that deserved careful attention. A woman named Sarah Whitmore, living in a secluded mountain cabin, approached Morrison in June with a disturbing story. Sarah was in her early 40s, living alone since her husband's death from fever years earlier. Her cabin was in a remote area, accessible only by narrow trails known to few. She explained that she had remained silent until then out of fear, but the discovery of the wagon and the renewed attention to the case convinced her to speak. In late October 1861, she had seen 3 men passing near her property, driving a wagon pulled by 2 horses. This alone would not have been unusual, except for 3 specific details she clearly remembered. First, the men were not following any known trails, deliberately avoiding normal travel routes. Second, they stopped briefly near a stream visible from her cabin, and Sarah noticed they were arguing heatedly, though she could not hear the words. Third, and most disturbing, she was certain she had seen dark spots on the back of the wagon that, from a distance, appeared to be the coloration of something she preferred not to name. Morrison questioned Sarah extensively, testing the consistency of her memory and searching for contradictions. She stuck to her story unwaveringly, providing details about the appearance of the 3 men that matched general descriptions of individuals known to frequent the darker areas of the Smoky Mountains. One, she said, had a distinctive red beard and carried a long-barreled rifle. Another was shorter and stockier, wearing a dark, wide-brimmed hat. The third stood further away, and she could not see his face clearly. This information opened entirely new investigative possibilities. Morrison began searching for men matching Sarah's descriptions, a daunting task in a region where many lived semi-nomadically and official records were scarce. He knew he needed to proceed cautiously. If killers were indeed involved, confronting them directly without solid evidence could be dangerous or prompt them to destroy any remaining evidence. While Morrison worked discreetly on these new leads, the Civil War continued to rage around them. Tennessee had become an active battlefield, with troops from both sides crossing the state. This upheaval had unexpected consequences for the investigation. Many mountain men were conscripted or fled to avoid military service, while others disappeared into the woods, joining guerrilla groups operating outside any formal military structure. The chaos of war created the perfect cover for criminal activity. The summer of 1862 brought stifling heat to the Smoky Mountains and an atmosphere of rising tension that seemed to poison even the air. Sheriff Morrison found himself torn between his investigation into the Brennan brothers' disappearance and the increasingly complex responsibilities of maintaining order in a county torn by conflicting loyalties. Confederate soldiers established outposts in several East Tennessee towns, requisitioning supplies and interrogating residents about Unionist sympathies. In this volatile environment, questions about a months-old crime seemed almost trivial to many. But Morrison was a stubborn man, and Sarah Whitmore's testimony had rekindled his resolve. He spent weeks cataloging information about men who matched Sarah's descriptions, building a mental list of potential suspects. The man with the red beard was particularly intriguing. Several people mentioned an individual named Rufus Crane, known for questionable activities in the mountains, including smuggling untaxed whiskey and possible involvement in petty theft. Crane had a reputation for violence when provoked, though he had never been formally charged with a serious crime. Morrison tracked Crane down in August in a rundown tavern near Pigeon Forge, a small town a few miles from Gatlinburg. The confrontation was tense from the start. Crane was a man of medium height, but powerfully built, with eyes that revealed years of hard mountain living. When Morrison mentioned the Brennan brothers' disappearance, something changed in Crane's expression, an almost imperceptible rigidity that the sheriff, trained in reading people, did not miss. Crane denied any knowledge of the case, claiming that in October 1861 he was working at a logging operation in Blount County, a considerable distance from where the Brennans had disappeared. He provided names of people who could supposedly confirm his alibi, though Morrison knew that verifying such claims would take weeks and would depend on the cooperation of individuals likely to lie to protect one of their own. Crane also mentioned, with a smile that did not reach his eyes, that many wagons passed through the Smoky Mountains, and it would be impossible for anyone to remember a specific one after so many months. Morrison left the meeting convinced that Crane knew more than he was admitting, but without concrete evidence to justify an arrest, the law required more than suspicion and intuition, even in wartime. He decided to maintain discreet surveillance of Crane and his known associates, hoping that some mistake would betray them. This strategy, however, became increasingly difficult to implement, as the county's resources were drained by military demands. While Morrison worked behind the scenes, Martha Brennan continued her silent vigil. She had aged dramatically in the months since her children's disappearance. Her hair was now completely white, her face etched with deep lines of grief. Neighbors brought food and offered support, but nothing could fill the void left by Thomas and William. Samuel did his best to keep the farm running, but the absence of two pairs of strong arms made every task more arduous. In September, a violent storm hit the Smoky Mountains, bringing torrential rains for 3 consecutive days. Streams turned into raging torrents, trails became rivers of mud, and several cabins in lower areas were damaged by flash floods. When the waters receded, a macabre discovery emerged on the banks of a stream approximately 8 miles west of where the wagon had been found months earlier. A 12-year-old boy, the son of a local farmer, was fishing when he noticed something stuck between the roots of a fallen tree on the stream bank. Upon closer inspection, he discovered it was a man's leather boot, partially buried in the mud, but surprisingly well preserved. What made the find particularly disturbing was that a human foot was still inside the boot, the bones scavenged by water and time, but unmistakably human. Morrison was notified immediately and arrived before nightfall. The boot matched the type commonly worn by rural workers in the region, making specific identification impossible. The foot bones were carefully collected and examined. A local physician, Dr. Henry Blackwood, determined they belonged to a young adult male, likely between 20 and 30 years old, consistent with Thomas or William Brennan, though not definitive proof. Morrison organized an extensive search along the creek, both upstream and downstream from where the boot was discovered. If floodwaters had displaced human remains, other bones might be scattered throughout the area. For 5 days, men scoured the banks, examining every deposit of twigs and debris left by the receding waters. They found additional fragments of human bone, all in an advanced state of decomposition, scattered over an area approximately half a mile along the creek. Dr. Blackwood examined all the recovered bones and concluded they belonged to at least one individual, possibly two. Although the dispersion and condition of the remains made absolute certainty difficult, there were no obvious signs of trauma to the bones, no bullet marks or fractures indicating direct violence. However, the doctor explained that soft tissue would have long since disappeared, and fatal injuries to vital organs would not leave traces on the bones. Determining the cause of death from the skeletal remains alone was impossible. Samuel Brennan was asked to examine the boot. He held it with trembling hands, turning it in the dim afternoon light. There was a distinctive patch on the inside of the heel, a repair he had made months earlier on one of William's boots. With tears streaming silently down his face, Samuel confirmed the boot had belonged to his brother. A terrible certainty finally settled over the Brennan family. At least one of their children was dead, and probably both. Martha Brennan received the news in silence. She did not cry or scream, merely nodded slowly, as if some part of her had always known this moment would come. She asked that the bones be brought home, so she could finally give her children some kind of proper burial. Morrison agreed, though he explained he would need to keep some fragments as evidence for the ongoing case. The funeral took place on a gray October morning in 1862, exactly 1 year after the initial disappearance. Few bones had been recovered, but Martha insisted on a full coffin, filling the empty space with clothing that had belonged to Thomas and William, personal effects, and wildflowers gathered from the mountains they loved. The local pastor conducted a simple service, his words of divine mercy and unfathomable mysteries echoing in the small wooden church. The months following the funeral brought a somber transformation to the atmosphere of the Smoky Mountains. The discovery of the remains confirmed what many already suspected. Something terrible had happened to the Brennan brothers, and those responsible still roamed freely along the same trails where the crime had been committed. This awareness created a sense of vulnerability among residents, especially those who had to travel alone or in small groups. The mountains, always imposing and sometimes threatening, now seemed to hold even more sinister secrets in their misty ravines. Sheriff Morrison intensified his surveillance of Rufus Crane and the men who frequently accompanied him. Among them was an individual named Luther Hayes, short and stocky, who habitually wore a dark, wide-brimmed hat, a match to Sarah Whitmore's description too disturbing to be coincidental. Hayes had a history of petty crime, primarily drunkenness and tavern brawls, but nothing that suggested a capacity for murder. However, Morrison had learned over the years that ordinary men could commit extraordinary acts of violence under specific circumstances. In November 1862, Morrison received information from a source who wished to remain anonymous. This person claimed to have overheard Crane and Hayes talking in a tavern after several shots of whiskey, when their tongues had become dangerously loose. The fragmented conversation included references to events from the previous October, vague mentions of wagons and horses, and something about a deal gone wrong in the mountains. The source could not swear they were specifically talking about the Brennan brothers, but the temporal context and indirect references were suggestive. Morrison knew that testimony from tavern conversations, especially from third parties, would carry little weight in court. He needed something more substantial, evidence that would definitively link Crane and Hayes to the crime. He began investigating the two men's activities in October 1861, discreetly speaking with people who might have interacted with them at that time. This process revealed something interesting. Both men had disappeared from their normal operating areas for approximately a week at the end of that month, only returning in early November. When questioned separately about this period, Crane claimed to have been hunting in the more remote parts of the mountains, while Hayes said he had visited a sick cousin in Knox County. Neither could provide reliable witnesses to corroborate their stories. Morrison carefully noted these inconsistencies, slowly building a pattern of suspicious behavior, even though he still lacked the conclusive proof he desired. The war continued to turn Tennessee into a battlefield. In the winter of 1862-1863, Union and Confederate troops fought numerous skirmishes across the state, leaving a trail of destruction and displacing entire populations. Many men from the Smoky Mountains were forced to choose sides or flee into the woods as deserters. This chaos provided cover for all manner of illegal activity, from organized theft to personal vendettas under the guise of political loyalty. Amid this turmoil, Morrison received an unexpected letter from a Union military officer stationed in Knoxville. The officer wrote about a man captured trying to sell 2 horses to a local merchant. Something suspicious about the transaction had caught the attention of military authorities, particularly the seller's inability to adequately explain how he had acquired the animals. Under questioning, the man admitted to having purchased them from Rufus Crane months earlier, though he could not recall exactly when. The description of the horses loosely matched those that had belonged to the Brennan brothers. Morrison immediately traveled to Knoxville, a difficult journey over war-damaged roads. The captured man was named Jacob Turner, a middle-aged trader with a dubious reputation, but no prior criminal convictions. When Morrison confronted him with specific details about the Brennan horses, Turner admitted that he had purchased 2 animals from Crane in November 1861. The price had been suspiciously low, and Crane had insisted the transaction remain confidential, citing issues with unpaid taxes. Turner provided specific details about the horses' markings and characteristics that matched Samuel Brennan's descriptions with uncanny precision. One animal had a distinctive white crescent-shaped patch on its forehead, while the other bore an old scar on its left hind leg from a past injury. These exact markings had been detailed in the circulars Morrison distributed months prior, though Turner insisted he had been unaware of those descriptions when he bought the horses. This was the concrete link Morrison had sought for over a year. Crane had sold horses matching those taken from the Brennan brothers just weeks after their disappearance. Morrison now had legal grounds to arrest Crane and Hayes for formal interrogation. He meticulously planned his approach, aware he had only one chance. If the suspects escaped, they could vanish into the mountains or the chaos of war, becoming impossible to find. In February 1863, Morrison gathered a small group of trusted men to arrest Rufus Crane. They found him at a secluded cabin, where he was reportedly running an illegal still. The approach was made at dawn, with fog still cloaking the mountains, catching Crane off guard. Morrison and his men quietly surrounded the cabin, blocking all escape routes. When Morrison announced his presence and intent to arrest, a tense silence followed. Then, unexpectedly, Crane emerged without resistance, hands raised in surrender, his expression one of resignation, as if he had anticipated this moment. Morrison handcuffed him and took him to the Sevier County Jail, while others searched for Luther Hayes. Hayes was located 2 days later in a Gatlinburg tavern, seemingly unaware of Crane's arrest. Confronted by Morrison, Hayes tried to flee, but was quickly subdued. Unlike Crane, Hayes showed obvious panic, his eyes darting frantically like a cornered animal. He was also taken into custody and placed in a separate cell to prevent coordination of their stories. Morrison began questioning immediately, starting with Hayes, believing he would break under pressure. For hours, Morrison pressed Hayes about his movements in October 1861, his relationship with Crane, and the horses sold to Jacob Turner. Hayes initially denied everything, but as Morrison presented each piece of evidence and contradiction, his resistance crumbled. In the third hour, Hayes admitted he had been with Crane in late October, but insisted they had done nothing illegal, claiming they found the wagon abandoned and the horses wandering, simply taking possession of what seemed ownerless. When Morrison pointed out this didn't explain why they hid the wagon in a remote ravine or quietly sold the horses weeks later, Hayes changed his story, saying they feared false accusation. His version unraveled with each question Morrison posed. The sheriff, with decades of interrogation experience, knew when someone was lying and how to pressure weak points in a narrative. He left Hayes alone in his cell for several hours, letting fear and uncertainty take hold, then returned with a new tactic. Morrison brought Samuel Brennan into the jail, allowing the young man to stare silently through the bars at Hayes. Samuel said nothing, but his eyes carried the full weight of his family's loss and grief. This silent presence created a psychological pressure no verbal questioning could match. Hayes looked away, unable to meet Samuel's gaze. After Samuel left, Morrison turned to Crane, who had remained remarkably calm during his 2-day imprisonment. Crane, a more seasoned criminal than Hayes, knew admitting anything could lead to the gallows. He maintained a simple, consistent story. He had bought the horses from an unknown traveler at a fair price, asking no questions about their origin, and knew nothing about the wagon hidden in the ravine. Morrison presented Sarah Whitmore's testimony, describing 3 men with a wagon that October afternoon. Crane smiled coolly, suggesting a lonely woman's memory after so long was unreliable, possibly confusing dates or people, and questioned why she waited months to come forward if she had relevant information. These were valid objections Morrison knew any defense attorney would raise in court. The legal situation was frustrating. Morrison had significant circumstantial evidence. The horses sold by Crane matching the Brennans, the hidden wagon, Sarah's testimony, Hayes's lies about his movements, but no confession, no eyewitness to the crime itself, and no physical evidence directly linking the suspects to the remains found later. A cautious prosecutor might hesitate to take the case to trial with these gaps. As Morrison deliberated his next move, external events again interfered. A Confederate military force occupied part of Sevier County in March 1863, taking control of local resources and authority over prisoners. The Confederate commander, Colonel Patterson, reviewed the cases of Crane and Hayes, and citing a lack of conclusive evidence and a need for wartime manpower, ordered both men released on condition of immediate enlistment in the Confederate Army. Morrison vehemently protested, arguing he was close to obtaining confessions and that releasing the suspects would jeopardize the entire investigation, but his objections were ignored. Patterson's military authority overruled civilian authority in Confederate territory, and he saw no value in keeping 2 strong men jailed when they could fight. Crane and Hayes were released in April 1863 and incorporated into a military unit departing for East Tennessee days later. The news devastated Martha and Samuel Brennan. After finally seeing progress, with the likely perpetrators in custody, they watched everything crumble under war's demands. Martha remained silent when told, but Samuel reacted with bitter anger, questioning what kind of justice allowed murderers to walk free while their victims lay in premature graves. Morrison had no comforting answers. The following months were a frustrating wait. Morrison tried to track Crane and Hayes through military channels, hoping to resume interrogations, or that one, isolated from the other, and facing war's horrors, might confess to ease his conscience. He sent numerous letters to Confederate commanders explaining the case and requesting access to the suspects. Most went unanswered, lost in the administrative chaos of an army at war. In August 1863, Morrison received unexpected news through military channels. Luther Hayes had died in a skirmish near Chattanooga, struck by Union artillery fire, his body buried in a mass grave. Any hope of a confession from Hayes vanished with him. Morrison recorded this with a sense of lost opportunity. Hayes had been close to breaking during that final interrogation. Rufus Crane survived the war, but disappeared completely after hostilities ended in 1865. Morrison tried to locate him through demobilization records, but Crane seemed to have vanished. Some said he had gone west to territories beyond the Mississippi, where names and pasts could be reinvented. Others whispered he was dead, a victim of a personal vendetta. Without a body or official confirmation, Morrison couldn't definitively close the case. The war years permanently changed the Smoky Mountains. Many families lost sons, husbands, and brothers in distant battles. Economic devastation left communities impoverished, forcing people to abandon family farms. In this context of collective loss, the Brennan brothers' case became just another tragedy in a sea of suffering. Martha Brennan lived until 1872, but never recovered from losing Thomas and William. Neighbors described how she aged prematurely, spending long hours on her porch, gazing at the mountains, as if still hoping to see her children return. She rarely spoke of their disappearance, but kept their few recovered possessions in a special trunk, visiting them like sacred relics. Samuel continued running the farm until his mother's death, then sold the property and moved to Knoxville, unable to live in a place haunted by painful memories. He eventually married and had children, but those who knew him said he carried a permanent sadness, a shadow in his eyes that never fully disappeared. Samuel seldom spoke of his lost siblings, but when he did, his voice held the same raw pain as if their disappearance had happened yesterday. Sheriff Morrison retired in 1870 after decades of service. The Brennan brothers' case remained the only significant failure of his career, the only major investigation he never resolved satisfactorily. In his final notes on the case, written shortly before leaving office, Morrison expressed his conviction that Rufus Crane and Luther Hayes had murdered Thomas and William Brennan, likely during an attempted robbery that escalated into violence. But without a confession or definitive evidence, the full truth would remain forever obscured in the mists of the Smoky Mountains. The years following the Civil War brought profound changes to the Smoky Mountains region. Reconstruction altered social structures. New roads connected isolated communities. Cities like Knoxville and Chattanooga grew, attracting people from rural areas seeking economic opportunities. Yet in remote cabins and small mountain villages, memory of past events persisted with peculiar tenacity, transmitted through stories told on cold nights around fireplaces. The Brennan brothers' case became part of local folklore, a cautionary tale about the dangers of isolated trails and how terrible secrets could remain buried deep in the mountains. Parents told the story to their children, emphasizing the importance of traveling in groups and wariness of strangers. Over years, specific details were lost or transformed, as with all oral histories, but the dark essence remained. Two young men set out on an ordinary morning and never returned, their lives cut short for reasons never fully understood. In 1878, a Nashville journalist named Edmund Clark visited the Smoky Mountains to research local history for a series on unsolved Tennessee crimes. Clark had heard references to the Brennan case and investigated further. He spent 3 weeks in the area interviewing longtime residents, reviewing newspaper archives, and trying to locate people who had known the Brennan family or participated in the original searches. Clark interviewed some surviving witnesses. Sarah Whitmore, now in her 60s and in frail health, repeated the same story she had told Sheriff Morrison 16 years earlier, insisting her memory of that day remained clear. She had seen 3 men with the wagon, and their behavior had deeply disturbed her. When Clark asked why she had waited so long to come forward initially, Sarah explained she lived alone and isolated, afraid of retaliation if the men discovered she had observed them. Another important interviewee was Benjamin Walsh, the hunter who discovered the wagon wreckage in 1862. Walsh, now in his early 40s, described to Clark the scene in that remote ravine, emphasizing how obvious it was that someone had deliberately hidden the wagon, covering it with branches and vegetation in a manner requiring considerable effort and time. Walsh speculated those responsible intended to return later to dismantle the wagon and sell the lumber, but something prevented them. Clark also located Jacob Turner, who had purchased the horses from Rufus Crane. Turner still lived in Knoxville, running a small animal feed business. He told Clark about the suspicious transaction with Crane, how the low price and insistence on secrecy had raised his suspicions from the start. Turner admitted he probably should have reported the purchase immediately, but struggling financially at the time, found the opportunity to acquire quality horses at a reduced price too tempting to refuse. Clark's article in the Nashville Tennessean in September 1878 brought renewed attention to the case. The detailed narrative reconstructed events from the initial disappearance through Morrison's failed investigation, the war's interference, and Rufus Crane's subsequent disappearance. Clark concluded his article with a melancholic reflection on how justice often eluded victims of crimes committed in remote places where witnesses were scarce and evidence could be easily destroyed or hidden. The article's publication generated unexpected correspondence, including a letter from a man in Arkansas claiming to know the whereabouts of Rufus Crane. According to this source, Crane had settled under a different name in the small town of Van Buren in Crawford County, Arkansas, matching the physical description. Clark forwarded this information to Sevier County authorities, but the response was disappointing. The new sheriff, who had taken over after Morrison's retirement, explained that without physical evidence or witnesses willing to travel to Arkansas for identification, there was no legal basis for extradition or formal charges. Furthermore, he pointed out that 17 years had passed since the crime. Memories had become less reliable. Key witnesses like Luther Hayes were dead, and crucial documents had been lost during the chaotic war years. Even if Crane were located and brought back to Tennessee, building a solid criminal case would be extremely difficult. Justice had practical deadlines, beyond which pursuing cold cases became a futile exercise. This response frustrated Clark, who believed serious crimes should not have an expiration date. He considered traveling to Arkansas himself to investigate, but financial constraints and professional commitments in Nashville made it impossible. Crane's supposed whereabouts remained unverified, just another intriguing clue in a case full of unsolved mysteries. In the 1880s, the Smoky Mountains began to attract interest of a different kind. Naturalists and scientists from Eastern universities discovered the region's extraordinary biodiversity, documenting thousands of species of plants and animals. Some of these visitors heard local stories about the Brennan case and were fascinated by the narrative's persistence in the collective memory. A Massachusetts botanist wrote in his journal about how locals spoke of the missing brothers with almost religious reverence, as if their interrupted lives had become part of the landscape itself. The ravine where the wagon was found developed a dark reputation. Locals began avoiding it, creating alternative routes for hunting and gathering even when it meant a longer journey. Some claimed to hear strange voices in the area on windless nights, while others reported an unexplained sensation of being watched when passing nearby. These accounts, likely products of imagination fueled by the tragic story, contributed to transforming the site into a sort of unofficial memorial to Thomas and William Brennan. Samuel Brennan died in 1893 at the age of 58. In his will, he left a small amount for the upkeep of the tomb where the recovered fragments of his brothers had been buried. He also left a diary he had kept sporadically over the years, containing his reflections on the loss of Thomas and William. This diary eventually came into the hands of a local historian who preserved it as a document of life in the Smoky Mountains during the 19th century. The diary entries revealed the persistent pain Samuel had carried throughout his adult life. He wrote of recurring dreams in which he saw his brothers calling to him from the misty depths of the mountains, always out of reach, no matter how fast he ran toward them. Samuel also recorded his frustration with the justice system that had allowed suspects to escape without punishment, his anger at the war that had interrupted the investigation at a crucial moment, and his constant questioning of whether there was anything more he could have done to protect his brothers or ensure their killers were brought to justice. The early 20th century brought even more dramatic changes to the Smoky Mountains. The logging industry began large-scale operations, clearing vast swaths of virgin forest that had lain untouched for centuries. Railroads were built to transport enormous logs from ancient trees, and worker camps sprang up in locations previously accessible only by narrow trails. This industrial transformation irreversibly altered the landscape the Brennan brothers had known, erasing physical traces of a previous era. During the expansion of logging operations in 1907, workers building an access road in a remote area made a macabre discovery. Digging through a slope covered in dense vegetation, they found human bones buried shallowly approximately 3 feet below the surface. The operation supervisor immediately notified local authorities. A preliminary investigation determined the remains belonged to at least one adult male buried several decades earlier, based on the state of decomposition and the condition of the bones. The county medical examiner observed something disturbing. Distinct marks on several ribs, and the left scapula suggested blunt force trauma, possibly from a knife or similar tool, indicating fatal violence. The location was approximately 5 miles from the ravine where the Brennan wagon had been found decades earlier, but within the general area where the brothers had disappeared. News of the discovery quickly spread through the local community, and older residents immediately made the connection to the Brennan case. The current sheriff, Robert Hriss, who had no personal connection to the events of 1861, reviewed old records and concluded there was a reasonable possibility the bones belonged to Thomas or William Brennan. Unfortunately, forensic identification methods at the time were extremely limited. Without detailed dental records or other documented distinguishing characteristics, determining identity with certainty was impossible. Hriss ordered an extensive search of the area surrounding the discovery site, hoping to find other remains or personal items that could aid in identification. For 3 days, workers and volunteers meticulously combed the ground. They found additional bone fragments scattered throughout the area, consistent with a body that had been partially disturbed by wild animals over the years, as well as pieces of decayed fabric, corroded metal buttons, and fragments of what may have been a leather belt. One button had a distinctive design, a style common on men's work shirts during the 1860s, a temporal detail supporting the theory that the remains might be those of one of the Brennan brothers, though it didn't provide definitive proof. Hriss consulted with people who had known the Brennan family, but after more than 40 years, few remained alive, and no one could recall specific details about clothing or buttons that could confirm identity. The discovery reopened old wounds in the community. Descendants of the Brennan family, including Samuel's grandchildren, were notified of the findings. They visited the site and requested the remains be buried in the family tomb alongside the fragments recovered decades earlier. Hriss agreed, allowing another part of the missing siblings to finally receive a proper burial, even though positive identification remained impossible. During his investigation of the old files, Hriss discovered something that had been overlooked or lost over the years: Among the original case documents, he found a letter written by Sheriff Morrison in 1870, shortly before his retirement. In this letter to his successor, Morrison detailed his final suspicions about the case and included information never made public. According to Morrison, he had received an anonymous letter in 1869, supposedly written by someone who knew Rufus Crane personally. The anonymous letter alleged that Crane had confessed to the crime while heavily intoxicated years after the events. According to this source, Crane and 2 other men had intercepted the Brennan brothers on the trail, initially intending only to steal their goods and horses. But Thomas Brennan had resisted, trying to defend his property and his brother. The situation escalated violently, resulting in the deaths of both brothers. The criminals then hid the bodies in separate locations in the mountains, hid the wagon, and discreetly sold the horses. Morrison was never able to verify the authenticity of this letter or identify its author. The handwriting didn't match anyone he knew, and no subsequent investigation revealed the identity of the anonymous informant. Morrison suspected it might have been the 3rd man mentioned by Sarah Whitmore, someone who had participated in the crime but had been plagued by guilt over the years. Without more information, the letter remained just another intriguing fragment of a puzzle that would never be completed. Chris considered officially reopening the investigation based on this new evidence and the newly discovered bones, but legal advisors explained that nearly half a century had passed. Key witnesses were dead. Rufus Crane was presumably deceased, though his fate was never confirmed. And the anonymous letter had no legal value without corroboration. Prosecuting such an old case would be impractical and likely fruitless. The best Chris could do was carefully document all new discoveries and add them to the permanent case file. The 1910s brought growing debate about preserving the Smoky Mountains. Conservationists argued that logging operations were destroying the unique ecosystem and that measures needed to be taken to protect what remained of the old-growth forests. These discussions would eventually lead to the creation of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park decades later. But in that early period, the debate was heated between those who saw economic value in resource extraction and those who advocated preservation. Interestingly, the Brennan brothers' case was occasionally mentioned in these debates. Preservation advocates argued that the mountains contained not only important biodiversity, but also rich human history, including memories of tragedies like the Brennans' disappearance. They suggested that turning the area into a national park would help preserve these stories for future generations, preventing them from being completely erased by industrialization. In 1923, a true crime writer named Harold Mitchell published a book titled Mysteries of the Appalachian Mountains, devoting an entire chapter to the Brennan brothers case. Mitchell had researched extensively, interviewing family descendants, reviewing newspaper archives, and corresponding with Sheriff Harris. His account was the most complete and well-documented of the case to date, though he acknowledged that crucial aspects of the story would remain forever unknown. Mitchell's book reached a relatively wide audience and brought renewed national interest to the case. Some people wrote to the author claiming to have additional information, though most of these claims proved unfounded or based on second-hand rumor. One particularly intriguing letter came from an elderly woman in Missouri who claimed that her late father had known Rufus Crane late in his life. According to this woman, Crane had lived under an assumed name in Missouri until his death in 1918, taking his secrets to the grave without ever publicly confessing his crimes. Her letter was fascinating for its wealth of specific details. Her father, a merchant in Springfield, had known a man who identified himself as Robert Carlson, but whose physical characteristics and mannerisms precisely matched Rufus Crane's historical descriptions. This man lived secluded on the outskirts of town, avoided prolonged social interactions, and occasionally dropped enigmatic comments about a past in Tennessee he preferred to forget. The woman reported that her father, in private conversations during Carlson's final years, noticed signs of profound psychological torment, excessive drinking, nightmares that made him scream at night, and vague references to horrific events in the Tennessee mountains. Although he never explicitly confessed to any specific crime, his hints suggested intimate knowledge of something dark. Harold Mitchell attempted to verify these claims through public records in Missouri. He discovered that a man named Robert Carlson had indeed lived in Springfield, died in 1918, and was buried in a local cemetery. Mitchell even traveled to Missouri and visited the grave, a simple, unornamented headstone that revealed little about the man buried beneath. There were no known photographs of Carlson, no records Mitchell could use to definitively confirm whether he was indeed Rufus Crane living under an assumed identity. This ambiguity perfectly illustrated the frustrating nature of the Brennan case. Every promising lead led to dead ends. Every possible answer generated new questions. The truth always seemed just beyond reach, obscured by decades and the deaths of all those with direct knowledge of the events. Mitchell concluded his book with a reflection on how some mysteries resist all attempts at solution, becoming a permanent part of a region's historical landscape. During the 1930s, as the Great Smoky Mountains National Park project took shape, historians began systematically documenting the stories of families who had lived in the mountains for generations. Many of these families would be forced to leave their ancestral homesteads when the park was established, and there was a recognition that their stories needed to be preserved before they were completely lost. The case of the Brennan brothers was included in this documentation as a significant example of the dangerous and uncertain life in the mountains during the 19th century. Interviewers for the Oral History Project spoke with extremely elderly people who had heard firsthand accounts of the Brennans' disappearance when they were children. A 92-year-old woman recalled her grandmother telling her about Martha Brennan, walking the misty trails, searching for her lost children. A spectral figure, dressed in black, who became a symbol of inconsolable loss. Another interviewee recalled stories about how the case had changed the way people traveled in the mountains, making them more cautious and wary of strangers. These interviews revealed how the case had profoundly affected the region's collective consciousness. It was not just an individual tragedy for the Brennan family, but an event that changed social behavior and perpetuated itself through generations as a cautionary tale. Children in the Smoky Mountains grew up hearing about Thomas and William, learning from an early age that the mountains were beautiful but dangerous, that they offered both sustenance and unseen threats. The official establishment of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in 1934 brought massive transformations to the region. Hundreds of families were resettled, old cabins were demolished or preserved as historic examples, and trails were formalized for recreational use. The ravine where the Brennan wagon was found was within the boundaries of the new park, as were many of the areas where searches had been conducted decades earlier. Park rangers eventually became familiar with the Brennan brothers' story, passed down among them as part of local folklore. Some reported strange experiences in certain remote areas of the park, unexplained sensations of melancholy or an invisible presence. Although they rationally attributed these sensations to suggestibility and prior knowledge of the tragic story, the experiences helped keep Thomas and William's memory alive, even as the physical world around them transformed beyond recognition. During the 1950s, a cultural anthropologist named David Thornton conducted extensive research on how rural communities preserve and transmit memories of unsolved crimes. He chose the Brennan brothers' case as one of his primary case studies. Fascinated by the story's longevity and the persistence of collective memory, despite the lack of a satisfactory resolution, Thornton interviewed dozens of people in the region, from descendants of the Brennan family to residents with no family connection to the events. Thornton discovered interesting patterns in how the story had evolved over the decades. Some elements remained remarkably consistent. The date of the disappearance, the names of the brothers, the fact that they were never fully found. But other details had transformed through oral transmission. Some storytellers added dramatic elements not found in contemporary records, such as supernatural omens before the disappearance or ghostly encounters in the mountains years later. These variations did not diminish the story's value as a cultural artifact, Thornton argued. On the contrary, they demonstrated how communities use historical narratives to process collective trauma and transmit important values. The Brennan brothers' story taught lessons about caution, about the fragility of justice in remote places, about how violence could destroy families and leave wounds that never fully healed, lessons that remained relevant regardless of the accuracy of each specific detail. In 1961, exactly 100 years after the original disappearance, the Knoxville newspaper published a commemorative article revisiting the case. The reporter interviewed local historians, reviewed all available archives, and visited significant sites within the national park. The article included photographs of the area where the wagon had been found, now densely reforested and virtually unrecognizable from its condition a century earlier. The article wistfully noted that everyone with a direct personal connection to the events had passed away decades ago. The last known person who had truly known Thomas and William Brennan had died in 1943. Now the story belonged entirely to the realm of documented history and cultural memory, disconnected from lived experience. This transition was inevitable, but carried a sense of additional loss, as if the brothers were dying a second time when the last person who had known them also passed away. The anniversary article generated interesting correspondence. An elderly man in Asheville, North Carolina, wrote claiming that his grandfather had known Luther Hayes before the war and had always believed that Hayes harbored a terrible secret. This man's grandfather had described Hayes as a tormented individual in the months leading up to his forced military enlistment, someone who drank heavily and spoke cryptically about irreparable mistakes. While this information did not fundamentally change what was already known about the case, it added another layer of confirmation to long-standing suspicions about Hayes's involvement. The final decades of the 20th century brought extraordinary advances in forensic science that would have revolutionized the investigation of the Brennan brothers case had they been available in 1861. DNA analysis, carbon dating, computerized facial reconstruction, and countless other techniques completely transformed the way old crimes could be investigated. Historians and unsolved mystery enthusiasts have occasionally speculated about what might be discovered if the remains attributed to the Brennan brothers were subjected to modern analysis.